Get your act together. That's oftentimes what you hear a parent to a child, but it's not very often that you hear a head of state to another one, at least not out in public, unless, of course, you're talking about Donald Trump, and, well, probably not a big surprise there. But what that's really going to mean is going to be a very different matter, because we've seen already when Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump have gotten into even a public tiff in front of God and country in the Oval Office back in February. Not a lot came out of that. I guess it remains to be seen what happens with this one, but we're in a little bit different condition now than we were in February of this past year. And so now then the question is going to be, what does all this mean now, and where is this war going? And to try and help us unravel some of this mystery and some of this parental finger pointing, etc., is Bill Buppert, former U.S. Army officer, military analyst, and historian. Bill, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Daniel. And it's such a pleasure to come on board. And I look forward to our analysis, as it were.
Well, let's just jump right into it then, because this one of the headlines is floating around out there today, where Trump is saying get your act together, and a lot of this is coming in context of Trump, basically crafting this. What started off as a 28-point peace plan, and then it apparently went down to 19, and then it went to 20, and then maybe it's 15 somewhere else. Who knows what the real number is? But it's going through a lot of iterations. Trump has spent a lot of capital. He's sent some of his senior folks, Hegseth and I'm sorry, not Hegseth, but the Secretary of State Rubio. He sent him over to Europe. He sent Witkoff to Moscow. Some other folks have come to meet with U.S. people in Miami, etc. And Trump doesn't seem to be very satisfied with where things have gone as a result of that. And based on what Zelensky has said in public, what the European leaders have said in public, I don't see a lot of narrowing of the views here of how we're going to get to a peace plan. How do you see it?
So what's interesting about all of this is that we always have to look at the larger tapestry and fabric that is going on around the entire conflict. Russia and the BRICS countries have settled into, since 2021, 2022, a very institutionalized and what I would call a very maturing alliance as far as what it was before that time during Trump's first administration. What's interesting right now is that the EU, NATO, and the US are not getting along very well. As you may have covered this already, there's for the first time in my adult life, there is serious talk of leaving NATO. I am a champion of leaving NATO. I am a champion of leaving the EU and leaving them to their own devices. I happen to think that the EU is entering a phase where I think they're going to be very detrimental to the United States as far as our national security, our economics, even the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes would be this relationship that we have had between the United States and the Anglophone countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and Great Britain, where even Great Britain has started saying, well, maybe we should reconsider that. We're seeing right now, for instance, that the nuclear deterrent that the UK has, which is very rickety because they build rickety submarines, and the entirety of the UK army, and by extension, all the NATO armies, they're midgets, basically. The reason I bring all of this up is because on the last 48 hours on Twitter, there's been a lot of EU flag waving going on. And what we're pitted with now, I think, is that despite Rubio and the Trump administration making noises where they wish to support Zelensky and the Ukraine, I don't think the EU and NATO and America agree on how that's to be done and who's in the driver's seat.
Well, I mean, that's definitely, there's no question about that. And one would automatically think, or at least heretofore, they would have thought that the United States is in the driver's seat, and Donald Trump, who, is this big personality, was assumed to be in the driver's seat. But when we see the Washington Post last night having this headline blasted across the front, Zelensky rules out ceding land to Russia, refusing to bow to Putin or Trump. And according to what the article said there, Ukraine will not surrender territory, Zelensky said on Monday, rejecting a central Russian demand that President Trump had incorporated into his latest proposal to end the war. Under our law, Zelensky said, under international law and under moral law, we have no right to give up anything, Zelensky said after the meeting with top European leaders. That is what we are fighting for. Well, okay, fair enough if you want to be fighting for that. But if you want to continue to get support from the United States, and if you want to continue to get, whether that's intelligence support, bombs, missiles, you name it, you're going to have to play ball, or you're going to have to risk losing everything. Now, I suspect, and I would like your view on this, that Zelensky definitely remembers last February when that whole disaster in the Oval Office happened and they got into this shouting match with Trump, and then how he was embraced with open arms and hugs and embraces and everything else after he left the Oval Office. And then Zelensky never did change his position. He did not go to what Trump wanted at that time. And now I think he calculates, I don't have to either. And I think that he's calling Trump's bluff. How do you see it?
So I think I'm being presumptuous here, but I'm certain you would agree. There's a term called realpolitik. Kissinger talked about this. And what it is how do international actors in an anarchic stage, which is what international relations is, how do they act in their own rational self-interest? In my mind, as much as I despise Zelensky from stem to stern in all of his behavior, which I think is just so bad across the board, whether it's fiscal, whether it's the way he's conducted his military operations over there, whatever the case may be, from his perspective, he cannot remain politically viable or alive, I think quite literally, if he cedes an inch of land because the Ukrainians won't tolerate that. So from a realpolitik standpoint, I understand him as an individual rational actor there. But the behavior from 2008 to 2014 with the Maidan Revolution, and then fast forwarding now, when I think for those who didn't listen before to the previous conversation you and I had, in 2008, William Burns was the ambassador to Moscow, Russia at the time, for the United States during the Obama administration, sent back a cable, which is a fancy word for an email, back to the State Department saying that the red line, the bright red line for the Russians was neutrality offered by NATO or membership offered by NATO to the Ukraine. And once that happened, because of this outrageous behavior of Zelensky and his predecessors against the eastern oblasts that are in the Ukraine, but are contiguous to the Russian border, that he would not tolerate that anymore. And I happen to think you and I don't have to be fans of Putin to understand him as a rational actor and what he's doing in his own nation's self-interest, and what the Europeans are doing and what the Americans are doing. Everybody is acting in their own perceived self-interest in this. And what's really causing a tremendous amount of friction, to go back to what I said in the first few minutes of this podcast, was that the Europeans are not wanting to play ball with the United States because they want to be in the driver's seat. And militarily, as you well know, they cannot be in the NATO midgets cannot be in the driver's seat because they do not have the martial heft to do anything, whether it's integrated air and missile defense or even troops on the ground and such.
Well, they can't be in the driver's seat as long as the big giant, the 800-pound gorilla, requires them to stay outside. But if the 800-pound gorilla doesn't exert his power, then they may think they can get into it. And I would argue that because of Trump has not exerted the power of the 800-pound gorilla, that he has allowed the midgets, in your analogy there, to say, maybe we can get up in the driver's seat. Because there have been, all the way through the Trump's term here, all throughout this year, there's many times that the Ukraine side and the European side have adamantly opposed what Trump said publicly, while giving fealty to him and making him sound, feel important, but yet on the policies they didn't. And now I think that's kind of where we are, that whether it's and in fact, Gary, let's pop that one from Chancellor Merz up there. He doesn't seem to be too worried about the 800-pound gorilla.
Some of it is understandable. Some of it is unacceptable to us from a European perspective. I don't see any need for the Americans to want to save democracy in Europe now, because if it could be saved, we would manage it on our own. In my discussions with the Americans, I say America first is fine, but America alone cannot be in your interest. You also need partners in the world. And one of those partners could be Europe. And if you can't do anything with Europe, then at least make Germany your partner.
And of course, you have Macron yesterday still saying, I've got cards that I can play. You've got Keir Starmer saying, we still want this just and lasting peace according to our definition, et cetera. These guys are not subordinating anything to Trump. And when Trump is saying these 28 points, radically different than everything they're saying, and yet they don't change their minds, what does that tell you about the leadership of the U.S. president?
I don't have the highest opinion of Merz, the Germans. I think that the Germans have taken the Morgenthau plan that was threatened to be imposed on them in World War II and self-imposed it with what they've done to their energy infrastructure, their industrial infrastructure, and they simply don't have the martial heft. As a matter of fact, I think in the last 24 hours, it was either Merz or maybe one of his generals who were talking about that the Germans are preparing to go into Russia. And my suggestion to them is that why don't they wait till June 22nd next year, which would be the 85th anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, right?
Yeah.
And then they can go in there on another failure cascade like they did then. Because as much as I admire from a military perspective, I'm not saying the politics of Germany at the time, World War I or World War II, but the Reichswehr and its successor, the Wehrmacht, were, since the Roman legions, were probably two of the most effective fighting organizations that we've seen in millennia, and they've both dissolved, and there's no resurrecting that with the Bundeswehr. And even when you take the Bundeswehr and you take French forces and you take such, I watched an interview with a retired British admiral, and I was shocked yesterday, Daniel, when he went on to say that the UK would be lucky if they could field a brigade of troops outside of the UK. I have no doubt that's the truth, because when you look at the totality of the of the British Army and such, 100,000 troops, but with tooth to tail, they could field maybe 10,000 with Royal Marines, their parachute organization, and their military. But how many of those are infantrymen and trigger pullers aside from that tooth to tail? They don't have the martial heft.
Right. Well, see, that's part of the problem. They don't physically have the martial heft, but they have the big mouth heft to where they're saying all kinds of things. And I had not seen that comment you said by the whether it was Merz or the German general.
David Starkey. Yeah, David Starkey for the first time invited a military fellow, because usually he doesn't deal with that. I really enjoy his commentary out of the UK. But he had this retired British admiral. I'll send you the link after this show.
Yeah, I had seen that one.
Okay,
and so that's one of the people that's telling the hard truth about what it is. But you see, with the Germans, we actually had a reporter on from the Atlantic on yesterday who had just published this big piece on the German military war machine being rebuilt, et cetera. And it's clear and evident from his interviews with all of these senior German people, whether it's military or political, is that they equate men in uniform and some cash in the coffers. I mean, they didn't say it out loud, but the implication being the Wehrmacht, that's all we got to do is, and we'll have that same thing, and we'll have the same capability. And I'm like, dude, it takes a lot longer to create an armed force. Despite however many men you put in uniform, you have to have the intelligence, the doctrine, the training, and all kinds of stuff, and a lot of time to build up people at different levels before you're even going to come close to any kind of capability.
Amen.
But they're talking, Bill, they're talking like that they're going to have that capability, I don't know, next June.
And it's impossible. That object that you have over your right shoulder on your fireplace mantle there is what has revolutionized infantry combat for the first time in an atomistic fashion in the entire time you and I have been paying attention to military history, going back to Roman times and before, which is that atomistically the infantry soldier or the fire team or the squad or the platoon or the company can be taken out in detail rather inexpensively on the battlefield, because 80% of all the casualties in the Ukraine are a result of FPVs and UAVs. And all of that is evolving so quickly. And the West, Stalin, I think he said that quantity has a quality all of its own. And when it comes to affordable mass, which is what the American phraseology is for having that kind of drone heft, as it were, the number of drones that one would need in the war of leakers that would be this missile age when it comes to that. We don't have it. We have a ceiling, we have a floor price, I think, that's gone down to $70,000 to $250,000 for these drones. But the Ukrainians and the Russians, And I'm looking at this. I'm an economist by training. I'm looking at this with a little skepticism as far as the pricing, but they are having cardboard and wooden drones that are rather large, carry munitions that they make for $3,000. So if you do that and you can establish that kind of quantity forward, then wow, it's just it's amazing what they'll be able to do. And the West is not prepared for it. The NATO midgets are not prepared for it. They don't train for it.
Yeah, you see on the screen right there, this is from Monday's Military Times, I think it is, that maybe by 2027, we could have 200,000 units. And as you certainly know, Ukraine and Russia both produce somewhere around 100,000 per month. So not sure that that's a big thing that we want to be bragging about. Take this with a grain
of salt, Daniel. Take these ambitions with a grain of salt. As far as you and I both know, I know that we're both steeped in decades of observing military acquisition in the U.S. and the West.
I was in an acquisition program, so yeah, I have painful experience at it.
So there you go.
Yeah. So let's get back to what all this is going to mean for this war and how things are going right now, because you have Trump trying to put on something close to a full court press with a lot of diplomatic heft to try to get this war solved, try to find something that the Russians will agree to, and then something that he should be trying to foist onto the Ukraine and the Europeans. Unfortunately, he's trying to actually encourage them, which is not having any success. But now that it seems like he might be losing his patience a little bit, here's what he was asked in an interview that published on Politico earlier today. And he was asked, who's actually responsible for the difficulties we're having?
Are you going to play something, or?
We are. At least I hope we are.
Which one are you thinking of?
Yeah.
The first one.
Got it.
Is Zelensky responsible for the stalled progress, or what's going on there?
Well, he's got to read the proposal. He hasn't read it
the most
yet.
recent draft.
That's as of yesterday. And maybe he's read it over the night. It would be nice if he would read it. You know, a lot of people are dying, so it would be really good if he'd read it. His people loved the proposal. They really liked it. His lieutenants, his top people, they liked it. But they said he hasn't read it yet. I think he should find time to read it.
See, now I'm sorry, this does not sound like an 800-pound gorilla who's telling you need to get in line here. This is saying, please read this document and consider it. How do you see this?
It's because at his heart, Trump is a New York City liberal. He doesn't understand.
Well, those are fighting words for a lot of the administration.
They are indeed, yeah. But that's why you invited me on, because I'm a different voice, I suspect. When it comes to the military, he does not have the military cultural competence, cultural IQ, nor familiarity with it, nor does he tend to hire the best folks to inform him, as evidenced by his first administration. I'm a little more encouraged now, but I think I mentioned the last time that we chatted together, we have this magnificent, very expensive military paper tiger that is fit for purpose. That's a term you and I would use. Fit for purpose for 20th century peer combat, but not fit for purpose for what we're fighting in 21st. If I said I meant 20th century peer combat, but it is not fit for purpose for 21st century combat in no way. None of the services have tackled that in a fashion, and jointly, none of them have acquainted themselves with the new way of warfare and peer combat. And by the way, you and I are familiar with this notion of near peer and peer combat. Because of UAVs, FPVs, and drones, I have reconsidered my position on that. And if you were to ask me, is Yemen a peer to the U.S., my answer will be yes.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah. And because of it, so if we take our martial engagements and our military thinking, planning with exquisite platforms and all the rest of it, we need to rethink everything across the board, from stem to stern, from top to bottom, vertically, horizontally. I mean, you're aware probably that when it comes to fires support and fires coordination, synchronization, which is incredibly important in peer combat, we don't have it in the services individually, and we certainly don't have it at the joint level. They do a lot of mouth breathing and lip service when it comes to saying, oh no, we've got it. But for instance, the Air Battle Management System, the ABMS, JADC2, and a lot of these other fire synchronization and coordination systems, a lot of ambition, not a lot of solutions.
Yeah, a lot of aspiration, but not a lot of
Yes,
field testing
exactly.
in
You said it better
relevant
than me. A lot of
environments.
aspiration. Yeah.
And and there's plenty of laboratories you can look at right now to see how this stuff works out. But yeah, we'll hold that for another day. But let's see if back to the idea that Trump may be losing his patience. So he was kind of, I think, a little too deferential, a lot too deferential to Zelensky on that one. In that same interview that they were asked, though, do you think it's time for him to actually stand for elections?
Is it time for Ukraine to hold an election, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. It's been a long time. It's hasn't been doing particularly well. Yeah, I think it's time. I think it's an important time to hold an election. You know, they're using war not to hold an election, but I would think the Ukrainian people would, should have that choice, and maybe Zelensky would win. I don't know who would win, but it gets to a point where it's not a democracy anymore.
I mean, that's either that's just an off-the-cuff comment by Trump, or it's an intentional statement to say that, look, you're not even a democracy. We're not going to keep not dying, but we're not going to keep funding a losing proposition on somebody who's not even a democracy anyway. Hold the elections, which of course basically means that this war is going to have to come to an end, because I can't see. Well, in fact, Zelensky would have to, by constitutional means in Ukraine, would have to end the martial law that's in case. That's because that's what's preventing the election from happening right now. How do you see that playing out?
So I think if I'm correct, in 1944, I think Churchill lost his bid to become prime minister again, or maybe it was at the tail end of the war, and then he came back in power in the 1950s. By the way, did you know that in Great Britain, in the UK, they didn't stop rationing food until 1956? And Churchill came in and he started addressing some of those, but Churchill was never much of an economist, and he was always captured by the Fabian socialists. The reason I bring that up is because if Zelensky stood in a free and fair election, maybe they even would employ voter ID, which I would urge them to do, he would lose. I have no doubt that he would lose, because there's a lot of families and parents and mothers and fathers there who have lost their sons in what they probably perceive as a losing proposition. I simply don't see the Ukrainians winning this war militarily in any fashion. And as much as it pains me to say it, for a country for whom portions of their country have been taken over through invasion by another country, there's no solution set other than a frozen peace, like we've seen with the stalemate between North Korea and South Korea, or a ceding of territory, those eastern oblasts that are contiguous to the Russian countryside there in the Ukraine. There's no other solution. But I've also been really irritated, and maybe I don't see it because I'm not privy to it. I always thought, why isn't the diplomatic front on the part of the Department of State in the US and the EU and maybe NATO members and the Russians and maybe even BRICS countries, where they meet at that very expensive teak desk in a nicely appointed office or set of offices in Geneva to talk about this? There's never a time when you shouldn't be talking, even during wartime. Going back to World War II, from January to August 1945, there were constant under-the-table talks with the Japanese, for whom unconditional surrender had been offered to them by FDR, but he was dead by that time. And they were always talking. I think when it comes to big peer wars like this, you should always be talking. But I don't think that's been happening. So I think that the calculus for Trump and the administration is he is measuring the barometer and the temperature of his positions more so for an American audience than a European audience, and the European audience doesn't appreciate that.
Well, listen, speaking of the Europeans, there's no question. It's overt. You've had in just the recent, I guess the last 6 or 8 weeks, you had Mark Rutte, who expressly said there will be no peace with the Russians. Even after this war is resolved, there's not going to be peaceful coexistence between them. He stated that. So we're not going to get back into a normalized relations. Ursula von der Leyen has said a version of the same kind of thing. And nobody other than Viktor Orban and Robert Fico are even talking to the Russians at all. And they don't want to talk to them. And somehow they brag on this and they think that that's a positive thing. And all of that in the context of this situation here, where Trump's trying to impose his will on getting a solution that the Western side will agree to. They're not going to do it, it looks to me like. So the question is going to be, what will Trump do about that? And that's what I want to focus on the last of the time we have here. And let's start off with back in, I guess, over the weekend in Doha, or maybe it was Monday, you had Don Jr. was being interviewed and point blank asked, would your father walk away from this? And he said, maybe. He said, the thing about my father, you don't know what he's going to do or something. But he said, yeah, he might walk away from it. Well, I guess it was maybe today, the U.S. NATO ambassador, Whitaker, was asked about that. And they said, hey, Don Jr. said that he might walk. Is that true? And if so, what is the American plan? Watch his action.
Don Jr.'s right. There may get to a point where if President Trump determines there's not a deal to be had, that he does step away from it. And that certainly, would be his nature. He does like having strategic ambiguity to be able to insert where he needs to insert. And he is expecting both sides to make progress. This war needs to end. He has been very clear about that. And the killing needs to stop. President Trump is the only one that can bring both sides to the table and work with them to mediate a resolution. There is no one else that can do it. If the United States walks away, if President Trump walks away, the likelihood of peace dramatically diminishes. And so, President Trump knows that, and obviously he's in a perfect position to resolve this, but it's going to take both sides. And if he determines that both sides are not serious about peace, he'll have to take that into his calculation. But ultimately, President Trump is the peacemaker in chief.
Okay, now that in context is important, because there was a time, and I want to say it was early April, where Secretary of State Rubio made a very similar statement that if we can't get the two sides together, Trump may walk. And I'm talking days, not weeks. He said back then. Well, he didn't walk then. So the question is, and the fear that I have is that the European and the Ukraine side, because nothing happened back in February, nothing happened in April when they said that we were days away from walking, that they don't believe this now. And they think that they can just continue on and that the president will continue to provide some sort of response, but he won't walk away. Do you think that there's an actual chance he could do it this time?
Well, again, we have to look at this from the perspective of what is Trump going to do and what's the best thing for America to do. If Trump wishes, in my mind, the best thing for America to do is to back out as soon as we can and let the Europeans solve this, because to me, it's a European problem more than an American problem. And I don't see, if there's no willingness for America to put troops on the ground, and God's willing that never happens because that is not the answer, then I think the only thing Trump should do is offer carrots and sticks to both sides in this case. The Russians, well, all three sides, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the EU, because it is a triumvirate, isn't it, when it comes to that, and NATO, and provide the tools that way. Because if we're the player that is not going to put troops on the ground, but we're going to provision them with weapon systems, things like that, which I also think we should stop doing, because all it's doing is allowing the BRICS country to use the Ukraine as a laboratory to examine how we employ our systems, our exquisite platforms, and how to defeat them. So when it comes to these kind of things, we have to examine what are the outcomes. The outcome is, can the Ukraine win the war? Absolutely not. Can the Russians win the war? The Russians can't take Ukraine. Can the Russians secure those oblasts in the east? No problem. Is a frozen peace, a stalemate, as I mentioned before about that DMZ, possible? Peace agreements have to be fleshed out here, and I'm hoping that the Secretary of State and all of his minions have the ability not only to come up with a peace agreement, but a menu of agreements that will satisfy Putin or satisfy Zelensky, or maybe satisfy them both. Although I think they're at Daniel, I think they're at so polar opposites when it comes to Putin and Zelensky's doing this to keep his head on top of his shoulders, is that coming to a peace agreement with Putin, I don't think will happen. And I don't think Putin will step down or stop or back down from the conflict.
Now, one thing I wanted to go down, you just said there, you said that Russia can certainly achieve the 4 oblast territorial areas of the oblast, but you said they probably couldn't take the whole thing. I'm curious why you think that, because from what I can see, I think that given enough time, especially if the Ukraine side doesn't come to any kind of negotiated settlement, they just won't have enough men to keep fighting. And at some point, I think that they could lose the entire country. How do you see it?
So I agree with you. I'm so glad you brought up that point. When you look at Ulysses S. Grant and his investment of Vicksburg and Gettysburg, which just so happened to fall in July of 1863 on the same day, July 4th, I think it was, when he was laying siege to Vicksburg, the Confederate works at Vicksburg, he had to use 80% of his military talent and triggermen to protect his lines of communication and his supply routes. The same thing applies here. There's a finite amount of Russian manpower, especially after being at war for 5 years, for them to take the entirety of the Ukraine, east to west, north to south. It's one thing to take that, not to mention what that capital city fight in Kyiv would look like for both sides. So it's one thing to take it. It's quite another to keep it, if they were to do that. And imagine, if you would, the guerrilla activity that either the US, NATO, or indigenous folks in the Ukraine could do to really harry, raid, ambush, and just put a lot of muck and mud and monkey wrenches into the Russian war machine if it were to take it over. And if Russia did that, and you and I are familiar with this because I think we've called it post-stability operations, or whatever the case may be. Do the Russians have a plan for that? Can they do it? I would think that they've probably been doing the planning, but imagine how politically difficult that would be. And imagine how this would stretch out the Russian war machine. Look what Iraq and Afghanistan did as far as not only stretching out, but exhausting the US war machine, and 2, at the time, not peer countries that we were engaged in.
Yeah, then that's my guess is that the Russians would be willing to pay for that, and I have seen evidence that they are planning for it. And one particular study I saw said that they have calculated a 5-year period after the conflict, the main conflict, is wrapped, that they would have to pay the price to do all that defending you're talking about here. But that apparently the Russians think that it is such an existential issue to secure their borders that they're willing to pay that, and they'll figure it out if it's after 5 years, et cetera. But the bottom line is that would be the absolute worst case scenario for the Ukraine people, to get into this bleeding ulcer kind of a situation. As painful as it would be for Russia, it would just be fatal for the people of Ukraine. And one of the big reasons why the most rational and logical and moral thing that the West writ large could do is to have a negotiated settlement that precludes that kind of continual bleeding of their manpower. So I even too many people, I think that would be bad for Russia, but they don't look at how bad it would be for whatever's left of Ukraine. And I hope that is not the case.
I think you're correct. And I'm so glad that you said that about looking at it with a Russian head instead of an American head, because the Russians, of course, in the last, over 200 years, because of Napoleon's adventures in the early part of the 19th century. And then, of course, what the Germans and others did during World War I. I mean, it was the Germans who injected that iron-trained bacillus of Lenin and his confreres into the body politic of aging and decrepit and sclerotic Tsarist Russia. And pretty much, I think you could say that the Germans were the root cause of Lenin and his confreres going in there and starting this successful Bolshevik revolution. And then, of course, we mentioned it earlier about Operation Barbarossa with the Germans invading. So I do think that they have an attitude to what you're saying, to sort of confirm your take on this. I do think the Russians have a culture of sacrifice and almost in my mind, an informed xenophobic fear of what Europe, the continent, is going to do to them because of their history.
Yeah, and that's in the theoretical realm and all these aspects of it, and we'll have to wait and see how just even this chapter plays out, because that'll probably go a long way to informing where the war ends up, as to how whether Europe and Ukraine can be, brought to heel, and whether Trump says get your act together and they do, or they don't, and he walks in so many different branches and sequels. Who knows where this is going to go? But we'll keep on top of it, and appreciate your analysis today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope to see you again. Thanks a lot.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Bill.
Bye.
And we appreciate you guys too. And just to let you know, just about 20 minutes from now, the ever amazing John Mearsheimer will be on to talk about Ukraine and NATO shoving Trump to the side. And we're going to focus on the European part of this calculation about what they're doing and how they're trying to push their own agenda. Do not miss this. John Mearsheimer at just 20 minutes from now on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.